Russia's energy weapon has just exploded in his own hands. And the most shocking part is this. It didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in courts, ministries, and oil terminals across Europe. Quiet decisions, legal traps, and policy shifts that turned Russia's biggest source of power into a long-term liability. Let's break down how Europe outplayed the so-called master of energy blackmail, step by step. Vladimir Putin built his power on a simple assumption. Europe could never afford to turn its back on Russian energy. For years, Moscow treated gas pipelines and oil tankers as political weapons, not just trade routes. Kremlin officials openly hinted that if Europe misbehaved, the lights would go out, factories would close, and entire economies would shiver into submission. You probably remember those winters, headlines about gas cutoffs, panicked debates in Berlin, Brussels, and beyond. The message from Moscow was always the same. You need us more than we need you. But that era is over, and the way it ended is nothing like what the Kremlin imagined. Today, Putin's doors to Europe are quietly, systematically closing. EU states are shutting down visas for Russians. The shadow fleet of Russian tankers, once free to roam global waters, is boxed in and hunted by sanctions. And most importantly, the very energy assets that Moscow used as leverage are being taken over, one, by the countries that once depended on them. The weapon has flipped. The gun that Putin held to Europe's head has been knocked out of his hand, turned around, and pressed firmly against his own temple. The story of how this happened begins with a single image: a huge refinery on the Black Sea coast, the Lukoil facility in Bulgaria, the largest in the Balkans. For years, it was a symbol of Russia's deep economic reach into southeastern Europe. Russian fuel, Russian ownership, Russian leverage, parked right inside the European Union. Today, it's surrounded by military police. Air defense and drone protection systems have been deployed around it. At first glance, it looks like the response to a terrorist threat. It isn't. The threat, in the eyes of Sofia, comes from Moscow, and that's where the tension really starts. Bulgaria is now preparing to seize and potentially nationalize one of Putin's most valuable assets on EU soil in the name of national security. Not because Bulgarian politicians suddenly woke up and decided they dislike Russia, but because a carefully designed legal trap, originating in Washington and supported by the EU, has left them with no other choice. That trap is built on sanctions. It forces European governments, including those that once considered themselves Putin's friends, into a brutal binary decision. Option 1. Keep working with Russian energy giants and risk being crushed under US and EU sanctions. Option 2. Move fast, seize or nationalize Russian-owned energy infrastructure, and break the dependency. Across the continent, governments are choosing the second option. Moscow calls it expropriation. The Russian ambassador warned that Bulgaria was setting a dangerous precedent. In one sense, the ambassador is right. But that precedent wasn't created in Sofia. It was created in February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Once Putin turned energy into a weapon of war, countries like Bulgaria were forced to choose between their own stability and their friendship with Moscow. They chose stability. And the signal that sends, not only to the Kremlin, but to Russian citizens, is clear. Putin's energy strategy has become toxic even to those who once tried to stay close. Because Bulgaria is not alone. In Germany, the massive Schwedt refinery, supplying roughly 1/5 of the country's fuel and previously controlled by Rosneft, has already been under state trusteeship since 2022. Berlin is now openly weighing a full nationalization. The logic is simple. Once sanctions and price caps fully bite, any Russian-controlled asset on EU soil becomes a liability, not just for Moscow, but for the host country's entire fuel system. In Romania, the government is looking at Lukoil's Petrotel Ploiești refinery through the same lens. The energy minister has made it clear that Bucharest wants control. Again, it's not about ideology. It's about ensuring a key part of the national fuel supply isn't chained to a sanctioned state. Bulgaria, Germany, Romania. Different governments, different politics, same decision. Take control of Russian energy assets before they drag the country down with them. Putin's energy empire in Europe, built over decades through pipelines, joint ventures, and quiet influence, is being dismantled in a matter of years. And the pressure isn't just tearing apart assets, it's tearing at alliances. Then there is Serbia, arguably the real stress test of Putin's influence in the Balkans. Serbia's energy minister has warned that the crude needed to keep refineries running could run out. President Aleksandar Vučić, under pressure from all sides, is now openly reconsidering his position. He has held calls with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, discussed regional security, and hinted that Serbia may revise its refusal to join EU sanctions on Russia in order to keep its European path open. Behind the diplomatic language, the message to Moscow is brutal. Serbian officials have noted that NIS, the Serbian oil company with Russian involvement, is insignificant in the overall revenue of the Gazprom group, but vital to Serbia. In plain speech, for Russia, we are a pawn. For us, this is survival. And we will not sink to protect your war. That is what erosion of influence looks like. Not dramatic speeches, quiet, reluctant, but very real distance. The erosion of Putin's position doesn't stop in Europe. It stretches into the markets where the Kremlin believed it had found salvation: Asia. For 2 years, Russian officials argued that if Europe didn't want their oil and gas, others would. China, India, and Turkey would simply absorb the flows, and Russia would pivot east. On paper, it looked like a neat solution. In practice, it runs into the same hard wall: sanctions risk. Nobody wants to be the one caught holding a sanctioned barrel when the music stops. Azerbaijan has restricted the ability of Russian oil to use its infrastructure, pushing flows back toward Russian ports like Novorossiysk. At the same time, Baku is aligning more closely with NATO standards. Its military is transitioning away from Soviet-era norms and toward Western ones, deepening cooperation with Turkey and other NATO defense ministries. Russian officials still insist that the situation in the region is stable thanks to Moscow's efforts. But the facts on the ground tell a different story. Russia's influence is shrinking, even in places it once considered firmly within its sphere. So what's the payoff? Who actually pays for this strategic collapse? The answer is not the oligarchs. It's not the officials with foreign passports and villas abroad. It is ordinary Russians. Right now, hundreds of millions of barrels of Russian oil are reportedly sitting on tankers around the world, part of the so-called shadow fleet, waiting, circling, or rerouted again and again as buyers hesitate. Some estimates put the figure at around 380 million barrels tied up in this limbo. When oil sits like that, prices have to fall to clear it. Russian crude is being sold at steep discounts, sometimes $20 or more below benchmark Brent, just to keep the revenue flowing. Even then, the taxes and export earnings that once flooded the Kremlin's budget are shrinking. Projects abroad, including some oil fields in Iraq, have been scaled back or suspended. The result is simple: less money coming in to finance both the war and the social contract Putin offered his citizens. For years, that contract was clear: stay out of politics, accept limited freedoms, and in return, the state, funded by energy money, will provide stability, pensions, infrastructure, and a sense of national pride. That deal is now cracking. When export revenues fall and the state can no longer subsidize unprofitable factories, managers have limited options. They cut shifts. They send workers on unpaid leave. They close entire production lines. Suddenly, tens of thousands of people in cities like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, or Tula can find themselves without a reliable income in the middle of winter, often in places where there is no alternative employer. That is how you create a lost generation. Skilled workers whose expertise has nowhere to go, families pushed to the edge, communities drifting into despair. History tells us what usually follows: rising alcoholism, crime, domestic violence, and a slow, dangerous buildup of anger toward those who made the decisions in Moscow. Putin promised a strong, respected, stable Russia. What many Russians are now seeing is something very different. A country increasingly isolated, economically strained, and abandoned even by partners who once stood close. The Kremlin's propaganda machine insists that Russia is simply at war with the West, that this is an inevitable civilizational clash. But the numbers, the refinery seizures, the tanker queues, and the quiet policy shifts in capitals from Sofia to Baku all tell another story. The world is not uniting behind Russia, it is stepping away from it. That gap between the triumphant narrative on state television and the hard reality of a shrinking energy empire and tightening sanctions is Putin's greatest weakness. It's where legitimacy erodes. It's where the old stability contract breaks down. It's where ordinary people start asking questions the system cannot easily answer. And once those questions start, they're very hard to stop. In practical terms, Putin's energy superpower doctrine is finished. A sanctions regime crafted in Washington and Brussels has managed to dismantle much of Russia's leverage in Europe and beyond without a single missile strike on a pipeline. Countries like Bulgaria and Romania have severed their last major economic ties to Russian energy. Traditional partners like Serbia are edging toward the West to avoid collapse. Asian buyers are hedging and reducing their exposure. Neighbors in the Caucasus are drifting toward NATO standards. The energy weapon that once held Europe hostage has detonated in its owner's hands. The Russian people will live with the consequences. In lower incomes, failing factories, unsold oil floating at sea, and the quiet realization that far from restoring greatness, their leadership has driven the country into isolation. Putin's media says, "We are standing up to the West." The data says something else. The world is walking away. That is the real battlefield now. One of economics, legitimacy, and public patience. And it's a battlefield that no amount of propaganda can easily win. If you've watched this far, I genuinely want to hear your view. Do you think this global energy squeeze could push Russia toward real change? Or will the system simply tighten control at home and push on? If this breakdown helped you see the story behind the headlines, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis. And if you have a friend who follows the war and the global economy, share this video with them. That's one of the strongest signals that tells the algorithm this kind of deeper content is worth pushing to more people.